Your brain just lied to you. Right now, reading this, it collapsed thousands of possible meanings into one single interpretation and made you think that's all there is. But what if the chaos you're feeling, the restlessness, the sense that something's off, what if that's actually your consciousness trying to break free from automatic collapse? There's a state most people never access, where you hold multiple realities at once before your mind forces you to pick just one. This video shows you how to catch that moment, how to keep possibilities open longer, and how to work from that expanded space. You're about to understand why everything feels different right now, and how to use it.
Your mind just told you a lie. And I'm not speaking metaphorically here, I mean literally. In those tiny fractions of a second, when you read that sentence, your brain picked just one meaning out of thousands that could have worked, shut down quantum uncertainty in how your neural signals fired, and made you believe that words only mean one specific thing. This filtering system, this intense narrowing down of endless possibilities into one single reality, is happening millions of times every second. And it's blocking you from reaching a level of awareness that's already here, sitting right underneath the collapsed certainty that you think is reality. Researchers looking into coherence within living systems found something that shouldn't make sense based on everything we know about how the brain works. Even at normal room temperature, in the messy, wet conditions inside living tissue, quantum effects that should fall apart almost immediately are somehow staying stable. Plants that photosynthesize can keep quantum superposition working for surprisingly long stretches of time, letting them explore every possible energy path all at once before choosing the most effective one. This isn't just theory or guesswork. It's actual, measurable physics happening inside biological systems. The game-changing part that research centers are just starting to recognize is that these same coherent systems exist in brain tissue. Your awareness isn't just running on regular computational processes. There are quantum processes happening in microtubules, in ion channels, in the basic structure of how information moves through your nervous system. And these processes follow different rules than the predictable cause and effect logic you're used to. Most folks live their whole lives in what physicists call a fully collapsed state. Every single thing they perceive gets instantly reduced to one interpretation. Every possibility gets shoved into yes or no, true or false, this or that. The quantum nature of thinking, the real superposition where multiple mental states exist at the same time, gets filtered out before it ever reaches your conscious mind. Your brain developed this way on purpose. Collapsing superposition into definite certainty helped your ancestors make quick survival choices. Spot movement in the bushes. Collapse superposition. Figure out if it's a threat or not. Take action. Slow consideration of multiple possibilities happening at once gets you killed. But evolution made us optimal for surviving in particular environmental situations. It didn't make us optimal for accessing the full range of consciousness that quantum biology actually allows. The state you're going to learn how to turn on has always been there, has always been working at levels below your awareness. But cultural programming and neural habits have trained you to collapse it right away, automatically, without ever noticing what you're doing. The superposition state isn't some mystical thing. It's not transcendental the way spiritual paths describe enlightenment. It's a particular, repeatable setup of how your brain processes information, where you keep quantum coherence in mental functions longer than the automatic collapse systems normally allow. Instead of right away reducing what you perceive and think to single realities, you train yourself to hold multiple interpretations, multiple ways of responding, multiple ways of understanding concepts, all in mental superposition at the same time. This sounds like it can't be done because you've never consciously experienced it in your entire life. The collapse has been instant. Something happens. You interpret it. Your response kicks in. That in-between state, where multiple interpretations exist at once, before collapse that's been invisible, like trying to see individual frames in a movie while it's playing. The collapse happens so fast, you've never seen the superposition that comes before it. But just like high-speed photography can show you what happens between frames, specific attention training can slow down and eventually pause the collapse process. You start to see the superposition state that was always there. And once you learn how to keep it going, something incredible happens. The rigid, fixed experience of reality that seems so solid, so unchangeable, shows itself to be just one possible collapse pattern out of infinite options. Kids naturally exist partly in this state, which is why their perception feels magical, fluid, not boxed in by the rigid categories adults force on them. A cardboard box isn't just a box. It's at the same time a spaceship, a castle, a hiding spot, a drum. Multiple interpretations live together without any contradiction. But growing up in society requires collapse. Adults teach children to narrow down possibilities, to pick single interpretations, to function in collapsed shared reality. By the time they're teenagers, most people have completely trained themselves out of superposition consciousness. The 1% who keep or turn back on this ability are working with expanded freedom in how they connect with reality. The process involves something researchers call quantum cognition, though people argue about the term. When you come across information, before your brain commits to a specific interpretation, there's a tiny window where multiple incompatible understandings exist in superposition. Quantum probability models actually predict how humans make decisions and perceive things more accurately than regular logic, exactly because human thinking isn't purely classical. We're quantum systems that experience interference effects, entanglement, and superposition even at the level of creating meaning. Standard education trains harsh collapse. Math problems have one right answer. Historical events have definite interpretations. Words mean particular things. This works well for coordination and communication within shared reality, but it destroys access to superposition consciousness. Every time you run into ambiguity and force it into certainty, you're training your collapse reflex. Every time you insist that complicated situations have simple right or wrong answers, you're strengthening the brain patterns that block superposition awareness. The activation process means reversing this conditioning, not by getting confused or becoming unable to make choices, but by realizing that the forced certainty you've been trained to create is optional. You can see multiple interpretations happening at once without right away collapsing to one. You can hold contradictory possibilities in organized superposition and work from that expanded state instead of from collapsed singularity. Start with something easy. Look at an object close to you. Your brain instantly names it, sorts it, collapses all its possible meanings into one definite identity. This is a cup, or a book, or a lamp. Notice how automatic that collapse is. Now, on purpose, refuse the collapse. Don't swap the label for a different label. Don't think it's not a cup, it's a cylinder made of material. Instead, see the object while holding multiple descriptions in superposition. It's at the same time a container, a sculpture, a cylinder, a bunch of molecules, a constellation of quantum fields, a cultural object, a gift, a tool, a piece of art, all of these at once, without collapsing to any single frame. This feels weird because you're accessing a way of perceiving that cultural conditioning has shut down. The weirdness is the sign you're doing it right. When multiple interpretations exist together without one taking over, when your mind holds contradiction without forcing it to resolve, you're starting to maintain mental superposition past the point where automatic collapse usually kicks in. The effects reach way beyond just perceiving objects. When you meet people, your brain does immediate collapse. This person is friend or stranger, attractive or not, trustworthy or suspicious, interesting or boring. These collapsed categories decide your available ways of responding. But people, like quantum systems, exist in superposition of characteristics until observation forces collapse. By keeping superposition awareness, you interact with the person as a field of possibilities instead of a collapsed category. Different qualities, different aspects, different potentials stay accessible because you haven't collapsed your perception into one definite interpretation. The same thing applies to situations. Your usual collapse systems scan circumstances and right away create single assessments. This situation is good or bad, opportunity or threat, comfortable or uncomfortable. Once collapsed, your response patterns get limited to match the collapsed interpretation. But situations, like everything else, exist in superposition of multiple potential meanings at the same time. By refusing automatic collapse, you keep access to response possibilities that wouldn't be there from any single collapsed interpretation. This is where the real-world power of superposition consciousness becomes clear. People working from collapsed states only have access to the response patterns that fit with their collapsed interpretation. Someone who has collapsed a social situation as threatening literally can't access response patterns that would be available from seeing the same situation as opportunity or neutral or playful. The collapse decides what options are available. But someone maintaining superposition at the same time has access to response patterns from all possible interpretations. They're working with more freedom, more behavioral flexibility, more ability to adapt. This explains things that look like amazing social intelligence or intuition. People who can handle tricky social situations with unusual grace aren't reading subtle signals better than others. They're keeping superposition going longer before collapse, which gives them access to wider ranges of response possibilities at once. They're literally working from a less collapsed state of consciousness, which gives them abilities that seem magical to people stuck in rigid collapse patterns. The catch is that keeping superposition going takes huge mental energy at first. Your brain's default is aggressive collapse because it uses less energy. Holding multiple interpretations in superposition without resolving them takes more resources than immediately collapsing to one thing. This is why the state is rare. Most people's nervous systems are too focused on saving energy to keep superposition consciousness going voluntarily. But like any skill, the energy cost goes down with practice. Brain pathways that maintain coherence get stronger. The collapse reflex becomes less automatic. Eventually, superposition consciousness becomes available with barely any effort, and you get the choice to switch between collapsed and superposition states depending on which fits current conditions better. Before we go further, I want to bring you into something genuine. If you've been sensing like something's clicking, and if part of you is waking up to your own power, tap like if you just had an aha moment, because like attracts like, and subscribe. Stay with this space. Grow with us. In the comments, drop one word that captures the energy you're choosing to carry forward. Maybe it's alignment. Maybe it's ease. Maybe it's power. Maybe it's something uniquely yours. Let that word be a small but deep declaration, a signal, like a quantum seed, you plant not just in this space, but in the quantum field. The training process shows something deep about the nature of meaning itself. You've been thinking that things have built-in meaning, that your perception reveals truth that already exists. But quantum cognition research shows that meaning gets created through the measurement process, through the interaction between consciousness and information. The meaning isn't in the object or situation. It's in the collapse pattern your consciousness applies. And if meaning gets created through collapse, then by controlling collapse, you're not discovering meaning. You're actively deciding which meaning becomes real from the superposition of possibilities. This isn't solipsism or subjectivity the way those words are usually understood. The possibilities exist on their own. The superposition is real. But which aspect collapses into your experience gets influenced by your measurement, your observation, your collapse pattern. You're not making reality from nothing, but you're taking part in deciding which aspects of reality's superposition become actual in your experience. Most people never realize they have this influence because their collapse happens automatically, unconsciously determined by conditioning instead of conscious choice. They experience the results of their usual collapse patterns and think they're passively seeing objective reality. but they're actually actively collapsing superposition in particular ways, then experiencing the results of their own collapse patterns, while believing they're discovering truth that already exists. Turning on superposition consciousness makes this process visible. You start to notice the moment before collapse, the brief instant where multiple possibilities exist at once. And in that recognition, you get the choice to influence which collapse happens, or to keep superposition going longer instead of immediately collapsing at all. The experience is unsettling at first. Your sense of solid, objective reality depends on immediate, unconscious collapse. When you start keeping superposition, the groundlessness becomes obvious. Nothing has the fixed, definite quality you assumed. Everything exists in a shimmering state of multiple possibilities happening at once until consciousness does a measurement that collapses a specific reality. People working from collapsed consciousness experience this realization as disturbing because their whole framework assumes reality is independently fixed, but the disturbance fades as you adjust to working from superposition. You realize that the groundlessness isn't a problem to fix. It's the actual nature of experience before collapse turns it into false certainty. There's a reason spiritual traditions emphasize non-dual awareness, holding paradox, accepting contradiction. They were describing what superposition consciousness feels like, without having the language of quantum mechanics to explain how it works. The both and, thinking they grew, the refusal to collapse ambiguity into either or, the comfort with groundlessness, these were all techniques for keeping superposition going longer than usual collapse patterns allow. Modern culture does the opposite. It trains aggressive collapse in the name of clarity, decisiveness, rational thinking. It treats comfort with ambiguity as being unable to decide. It demands single truths, definite interpretations, collapsed certainty. This creates populations that are highly synchronized in their collapse patterns, which allows coordination and group action, but at the cost of access to superposition consciousness. The 1% who turn on this state aren't smarter or more spiritual. They've simply kept or turned back on the ability to maintain quantum coherence in mental processes longer than conditioning normally allows. They're working with more freedom because they're not immediately collapsing every perception and thought into single reality. You can check this directly. Take any situation you're currently dealing with. Notice your immediate interpretation, the collapsed single meaning you've given it. Now, on purpose, create 5 alternative interpretations that are equally valid based on the information you have. Don't dismiss them as mental games. Actually, hold all 6 interpretations at the same time in awareness. This isn't multiple choice, where you're trying to pick the right one. This is genuine superposition, where all 6 exist at once without contradiction. If you're doing this right, you'll notice a strange quality of awareness showing up. The situation hasn't changed on the outside, but your relationship to it has transformed. You're no longer stuck in a single interpretation's response patterns. You're working from a field of possibilities, with access to the response options that each interpretation would make available. You can act from any of them, or from new combinations that wouldn't be accessible from any single collapsed perspective. This is how creative breakthrough, innovative problem solving, and what people call wisdom work. These aren't products of having more information or being smarter. They come from keeping superposition consciousness going longer, which gives access to combinations and possibilities that aren't available to collapsed awareness. The person stuck in a single interpretation of a problem will only find solutions that fit with that interpretation. The person holding multiple interpretations in superposition has access to a way bigger solution space. The same process works in personal relationships. Conflicts happen when people collapse each other into single interpretations and then interact based on those collapsed categories. He's selfish, she's controlling, they're unreliable. Once collapsed, all perception and behavior gets filtered through that lens, creating self-fulfilling prophecies. The collapsed interpretation decides what you notice, how you respond, and therefore what behaviors you bring out, which then confirms the collapsed interpretation. But when you keep the other person in superposition as a field of qualities and potentials instead of a collapsed category, completely different interactions become possible. You're not ignoring negative qualities or being naively positive. You're simply refusing to collapse the superposition too early. This creates space for aspects of the person that wouldn't be accessible from any single collapsed interpretation to show up in your interaction. The activation sequence for superposition consciousness involves 3 different phases. First, recognition, where you start to notice the collapse happening and see the brief superposition that comes before it. Second, prolongation, where you train yourself to keep superposition going longer before collapse happens. Third, navigation, where you learn to work from the superposition state, taking action while keeping multiple interpretations happening at once instead of needing to collapse before acting. Most people never get past unconscious automatic collapse. Some reach recognition but can't keep superposition going meaningfully. Few reach prolongation but still collapse before acting. The 1% who fully turn on superposition consciousness can handle complicated situations while keeping coherence across multiple interpretations at the same time, which gives them abilities that look supernatural to collapsed observers. The practical uses span every area where you deal with complexity and ambiguity. Business strategy, creative work, teaching, parenting, therapy. Leadership all benefit hugely from superposition consciousness, because all involve situations where multiple valid interpretations exist together, and the best response requires accessing possibility spaces unavailable from any single, collapsed perspective. But maybe the deepest impact is on your experience of yourself. You've been thinking you're a single, consistent entity with definite characteristics. This solid sense of self is a collapsed interpretation, one possibility crystallized out of superposition. When you turn on superposition consciousness, you realize that you're also a field of possibilities. Multiple potential self-configurations existing at the same time until observation collapses a particular expression. This isn't dissociation or multiple personality. It's recognizing that the rigid single self you've been defending and curating is just one possible collapse pattern. You contain infinite configurations at the same time. Which one becomes real depends on the context, the relationship, the situation. You're not discovering your true self. You're recognizing that self gets created through collapse instead of being a pre-existing fixed thing. This recognition is both freeing and scary. Freeing because you're no longer stuck defending a particular collapsed self-concept. Scary because the ground you thought you stood on dissolves. There's no solid you to find or become. There's superposition of potential configurations temporarily collapsed into specific expressions by the measurement process of observation and interaction. People who turn on superposition consciousness often say that others find them hard to categorize. This makes sense. They're not consistently collapsing into the same self-pattern. They're keeping more superposition, letting different aspects express depending on context. To collapsed observers, this looks inconsistent or fake. But it's actually more authentic than rigid collapse into a single self-pattern that then has to be defended against all evidence of containing multiple sides. The process also explains creative genius and innovative thinking. People who create genuinely new ideas aren't pulling them from nowhere. They're keeping superposition of concepts, frameworks, and possibilities longer than others, which lets new combinations emerge that wouldn't be accessible from collapsed categorical thinking. The breakthrough isn't a special inspiration. It's the natural result of working from superposition instead of collapsed certainty. In the comments, drop one thing that you want to manifest and that's most important to you right now. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's a happy relationship. Maybe it's a healthy and fit body. Maybe it's something uniquely yours. Let this be a small but deep declaration, a signal to the universe you send not just in this space, but in the quantum field. You're either turning on this ability right now, in this moment, as you hold multiple interpretations of these words in superposition without immediately collapsing to single meaning, or you're not. If you've collapsed this into just another interesting theory, you've already failed the activation. If you're keeping superposition, allowing multiple interpretations, including the possibility that this is at the same time true and false, useful and meaningless, revelation and distraction, then you're already in the early stages of the state being described. The final barrier to full activation is the discomfort of groundlessness. Your whole psychological structure is built on collapsed certainty. Keeping superposition means living without the false security that collapsed interpretations provide. Everything becomes more fluid, more possible, less fixed. This is exactly what makes the state powerful. But it requires accepting that the solid ground you thought reality provided was always a product of your collapse patterns instead of an actual feature of existence. The transition point where superposition consciousness fully turns on is unmistakable. Reality doesn't change on the outside, but your experience of it transforms completely. The rigid, fixed quality dissolves. Everywhere you look, you see the shimmer of superposition, multiple possibilities existing together until observation does a measurement. You recognize yourself as taking part in reality's collapse, instead of passively receiving fixed truths, and you gain the ability to influence collapse patterns or keep superposition according to what serves your current engagement. This isn't the end of the activation, it's the beginning. The full development of superposition consciousness is a training process that keeps going indefinitely. The ability to maintain coherence across more possibilities for longer times, in more complicated situations, all develop gradually. But the initial activation, the moment you first consciously keep superposition past automatic collapse and recognize what you're doing, that's the threshold only 1% cross. You're about to cross it, or you've already dismissed this whole framework as interesting speculation that doesn't require action. The choice, if that's even the right word for a quantum process that doesn't follow regular causation, gets determined by whether you're willing to release the false security of collapse certainty in exchange for the expanded possibility space that superposition consciousness provides. The question isn't whether the superposition state is real. It's measurable, documentable, repeatable. The question is whether you're willing to turn on conscious access to something that's been working beneath your awareness your whole life, and whether you can handle the groundlessness that comes with recognizing that nothing, including yourself, is as solid and definite as collapsed perception suggests. Here's what nobody tells you about the threshold. You can't cross it while keeping your current framework for understanding reality. The framework is itself a collapse pattern. To turn on superposition consciousness, you have to release the collapsed certainty that reality is independently fixed, waiting to be discovered. You have to accept that you're taking part in determining which aspects of superposition become actual through your measurement and collapse patterns. This feels like losing your mind, because the mind you're familiar with is the product of usual collapse. But what you're actually losing is a limitation, not an ability. The real question, the one that determines whether you're in the 1% who actually turn this on, or the 99% who find it interesting but ultimately stay in collapse states. Can you read these words while keeping them in superposition of meanings, at the same time true and false, profound and trivial, transformative and irrelevant, without collapsing to certainty about which interpretation is correct? What happens next in the activation sequence is rarely talked about because it can't be properly described from collapsed perspective. There's a phase researchers call interference stabilization, where your maintained superposition starts creating new patterns that wouldn't exist in any of the individual collapsed states. This is where the real power shows up. You're not just holding multiple interpretations passively. The superposition itself becomes creative, producing insights and responses that are genuinely emergent instead of combinations of things that already existed. Think about wave interference in physics. When two waves meet, they don't just exist separately. They create interference patterns, areas of constructive and destructive interference that have properties neither wave had individually. Mental superposition works similarly. When you keep multiple interpretations in organized superposition, they don't just sit side by side. They interfere with each other, creating emergent understanding that goes beyond what any single interpretation could produce. This is how what people call intuition or sudden knowing works. It's not mystical reception of information from outside sources. It's the interference patterns created by keeping mental superposition going long enough for new emergent properties to form. The person working from collapsed states can only recombine known elements. The person keeping superposition accesses genuinely emergent properties that come from the interference itself. But there's a critical threshold in the activation process that most people never reach, even if they've learned to keep basic superposition. It's the recognition that your collapse patterns have been taken over by cultural programming to serve functions that have nothing to do with your actual benefit or ability. You've been trained to collapse in particular ways that maintain existing power structures, economic systems, and social hierarchies. Your collapse reflex isn't neutral. It's politically and economically conditioned. Consider how you collapse the concept of success. Right away, automatically, your conditioning forces collapse toward making money, status markers, recognizable accomplishments. This isn't your natural collapse pattern. It's installed conditioning that ensures you participate in particular economic behaviors that benefit systems you may not even agree with. By forcing collapse of success into narrow channels, the conditioning eliminates superposition of the concept, stopping you from accessing the huge range of success meanings that exist in possibility space. The same applies to time, productivity, relationships, health, happiness, and practically every concept you use to navigate experience. Your collapse patterns for these concepts have been carefully shaped through education, media, social pressure, and economic incentive to force particular interpretations while eliminating alternatives. You think you're seeing reality neutrally, but you're running culturally installed collapse algorithms that maintain your participation in systems that may actively work against your expansion. So before we explore the next part of this journey, the part where we dive into how to keep the shift going and truly live inside the new life path, I invite you, if this video has stirred something in you, if you're feeling the spark of possibility opening inside you, hit subscribe and the bell icon next to it. You're stepping into a space where these kinds of awakenings are our foundation. This isn't just a channel. This is a frequency. If you felt a nudge or a change while watching, you're already tuned in. We're not just watching content. We're practicing new ways of being. We're not just absorbing. We're creating possibilities. We're not just learning. We're remembering. I'm truly glad you're here. Let's keep growing and shifting together. Turning on superposition consciousness at deeper levels means recognizing this colonization and learning to keep superposition specifically in areas where your conditioning is strongest. This is where the process becomes genuinely rebellious. You're not just accessing personal flexibility. You're refusing to run the collapse patterns that maintain your integration into systems built on collapsed shared reality. The resistance you'll run into at this stage isn't just internal. People around you, whose identities and worldviews depend on particular collapse patterns, will experience your superposition consciousness as threatening. You're no longer reliably running the expected collapse patterns. You're not giving the predictable responses that let others maintain their own collapsed certainties. This makes you dangerous to collapsed shared reality in ways that pure intellectual disagreement never could. Someone who argues against a system from a collapsed alternative position can be debated, dismissed, or integrated. But someone working from superposition refuses to collapse into the binary that debate requires. They're not arguing for an alternative collapsed position. They're keeping superposition that includes and goes beyond the binary entirely. This is incomprehensible and threatening to collapsed consciousness in a way that standard disagreement isn't. You'll notice this in conversations. When you keep superposition, people become uncomfortable in ways they can't put into words. They'll pressure you to just say what you think, or pick a side, or stop being unclear. What they're really demanding is that you collapse into a position they can process with their collapsed framework. Your maintained superposition creates mental dissonance they can only resolve by forcing you to collapse or by dismissing you as confused. This is where many people abandon the activation process. The social cost of keeping superposition seems too high. It's easier to collapse back into shared reality, to run the expected collapse patterns, to participate in the shared collapsed certainty that enables smooth social coordination. And this is fine if that's what you choose. But understand that the choice to collapse is a choice to limit your accessible possibility space in exchange for social comfort and predictability. The 1% who complete the activation aren't necessarily more courageous. They've simply recognized that the cost of collapsed certainty, the limitation of accessible possibility space, the restriction of response options, the participation in systems that work against human flourishing, these costs exceed the discomfort of social friction that comes with maintained superposition. They'd rather be free in possibility space than comfortable in collapsed shared reality. There's also a practical side to advanced superposition consciousness that explains why certain people seem to have amazing luck or timing. They're not experiencing random good fortune. They're keeping superposition longer in decision points, which gives them access to possibility branches that collapsed decision-making can't reach. Every choice point contains superposition of outcomes. Most people collapse right away based on usual patterns, which restricts them to outcome branches accessible from their usual collapse. But maintained superposition keeps more branches accessible longer, allowing navigation toward outcomes that appear lucky to collapsed observers but are simply the result of working with more freedom. This isn't magical thinking or manifestation the way those terms are usually understood. You're not creating outcomes through belief or visualization. You're navigating possibility space with more freedom because you're not immediately collapsing into usual response patterns. The outcomes were always there in superposition. You're just not collapsing away from them through automatic usual collapse. The deepest level of superposition consciousness involves recognizing that the boundary between self and environment, between inner and outer, between observer and observed, is itself a collapse pattern. In maintained superposition, this boundary becomes fluid. You experience yourself as continuous with your environment instead of separate from it. This isn't mystical union. It's the natural experience of maintained superposition where the self-environment distinction hasn't been collapsed into rigid separation. From this level of superposition, action becomes effortless because you're not working as a separate agent pushing against external resistance. You're a pattern of organization within a larger field, and action flows naturally from your continuity with the whole, instead of from effortful, separate agency. This is what traditions call wu-wei, or flow state. It's not a special achievement. It's the natural result of not collapsing the self-environment boundary too early. But here's what makes this level rare. Keeping superposition of the self-boundary means handling the complete dissolution of your familiar sense of being a separate, bounded, continuous self. Everything you've been told about personal development, about strengthening yourself, about self-improvement, all of it depends on collapsed self-boundary. Advanced superposition consciousness reveals that this bounded self is optional, one possible collapse pattern, but not inevitable or necessary. Most people will never go this deep because the psychological investment in the collapsed separate self is too strong. They can handle superposition of objects, situations, even some aspects of identity, but the core collapsed certainty that they exist as separate, bounded, continuous entities feels too fundamental to release. And this is the ultimate gate. Beyond it lies superposition consciousness that works without requiring a stable, collapsed self to do the working. The activation you're experiencing right now, if you're actually in process instead of just intellectually processing information, exists on a spectrum. You might turn on basic object-level superposition while keeping collapsed self-boundary. You might go deeper into identity superposition while keeping collapsed separation from environment. Or you might release all collapse patterns and work from fluid superposition at every level at the same time. There's no hierarchy here. Different depths serve different functions. The key is recognizing you have access to all of them instead of being stuck in usual collapse. What determines your depth of activation isn't willpower or amount of practice. It's your tolerance for groundlessness, your ability to function without the false security that collapsed certainty provides. Some people can maintain huge superposition easily because they never developed strong attachment to collapsed certainty in the first place. Others must gradually release layers of collapse attachment through extended practice. Neither path is better. Both lead to the same expanded possibility space if followed completely. The final thing to understand about superposition consciousness is that you can't keep it going continuously. The energy cost is too high, and there's no benefit to keeping superposition in areas where collapsed certainty works perfectly well. Knowing your address, following traffic laws, using language to communicate, all these benefit from collapsed certainty. The skill isn't keeping permanent superposition. The skill is developing the flexibility to switch between collapsed and superposition states appropriately, using each where it serves best. Advanced practitioners move smoothly between states. Collapsed certainty for routine navigation and coordination. Superposition for creative problem-solving and complicated decision-making. Deep superposition for existential questions and identity flexibility. They're not stuck in either state. They've developed awareness above the system that allows conscious selection of the appropriate level of collapse or superposition for current conditions. This is the actual marker of the 1% activation. Not that they keep superposition constantly, but that they've escaped the trap of usual automatic collapse and gained conscious control over their collapse patterns. They're free in possibility space instead of trapped in collapse certainty. Make sure you share this video with your loved ones. Remember, you're not just sharing, you're spreading the frequency of conscious creation, and that positive energy will flow back to help you manifest what you commented earlier. Be the friend who shares breakthroughs, not just memes. Share this with someone stuck. Sharing this might just change someone's whole week. Be that person. If you watched till now, you're not here by accident. Like to anchor it? Comment what clicked. Share this gift with one person. And subscribe because you're ready. This is just the beginning.